The janitor's cart squeaked faintly as old Mr. Harold shuffled down the gleaming tile hallway of the corporate building, his hands trembling slightly as he pushed the tools of his trade. The worn uniform he wore had seen better days, but so had Harold. At 72 years old, every movement was deliberate, every step a quiet testament to decades of hard work. Most people in the office ignored him, just as they ignored the gleaming floors he scrubbed nightly or the pristine restrooms he meticulously cleaned. Harold didn't mind, he was used to being invisible. What he didn't know was that tonight, someone was about to make sure he felt seen in the worst possible way. It started like any other night. Harold's shift was well underway, the building mostly quiet now that the day workers had gone home. He liked this time of night when he could do his job in peace without anyone rushing past him or leaving fresh coffee stains in the break room just as he'd wiped the counters clean. But there was one person who hadn't left yet. Ugh, this place is disgusting. Where's that janitor? Harold, or whatever his name is. The voice carried down the hallway, sharp and mocking. Harold paused, recognizing it instantly. It belonged to Mr. Lawrence, one of the senior managers, known for his short temper and even shorter patience. Harold sighed and continued pushing his cart toward the restroom. He'd heard worse in his time, and he wasn't one to pick fights. Inside the restroom, Harold set about his work. The smell of bleach filled the air as he scrubbed the sinks and wiped down the mirrors, humming softly to himself. It was the kind of work he took pride in, even if no one else appreciated it. Unbeknownst to Harold, the restroom door swung open. In strode Lawrence, phone pressed to his ear, voice dripping with irritation. "Yeah, still here. Had to stay late because someone can't file a report properly," Lawrence grumbled, pacing near the stalls. His tone shifted suddenly, filled with disdain. "And don't even get me started on the staff here. They hire anyone these days. I mean, the janitor. He's ancient. Probably started here when this building was built." Harold froze mid-scrub, his grip tightening on the cloth in his hand. He wasn't a confrontational man, but the words stung. He tried to focus on the task at hand, determined to let it roll off his back. But Lawrence wasn't done. "It's embarrassing, really. A company like ours, and we have someone like him cleaning up after us. He's too old to be working anyway. They should just send him home and hire someone who can actually move at a decent speed." Harold clenched his jaw, the words cutting deeper than he expected. He wasn't slow. He wasn't useless. He was doing his best, always had. But in this moment, standing in a restroom he'd just made spotless, Harold felt small. Invisible. What neither man realized was that the restroom wasn't empty. In the farthest stall, a figure sat silently, listening intently. The air seemed to thicken as Lawrence's tirade continued, each word landing like a stone in the stillness. "And don't get me started on his attitude," Lawrence sneered, chuckling to himself. "Acts like he's doing us a favor by being here. Please. He should be grateful we even let him through the door." In the stall, the figure shifted, their presence cloaked by the sound of Lawrence's voice. They weren't just listening, they were taking in every word, every sneer, every insult. Harold straightened, his eyes burning with unshed tears as he packed up his supplies. He didn't want to give Lawrence the satisfaction of knowing he'd gotten under his skin. As he turned to leave, Lawrence muttered one final jab. "Honestly, it's pathetic. If I were him, I'd be too ashamed to show my face." The words echoed in Harold's mind as he walked out of the restroom, shoulders slumped and heart heavy. But inside the stall, the figure remained, waiting until the door swung shut behind Lawrence. Then, slowly, they emerged. The story doesn't end here. What happens next will change everything: Harold's life, Lawrence's reputation, and the very fabric of this company. But for now, one thing is certain: the man who thought he was alone in that restroom is about to learn the hard way that words have consequences. And the person who overheard it all, they have the power to ensure those consequences are delivered. Stay tuned for what happens next, because justice, no matter how delayed, always finds a way. As the door to the restroom swung shut, the man who had remained unseen lingered for a moment longer. He took a deep breath, his expression unreadable, before stepping out into the fluorescent light. He wasn't the type to eavesdrop, but what he'd heard couldn't be ignored. It wasn't just the cruel words that struck a nerve, it was the tone, the arrogance, the complete disregard for another human being. The man glanced at the pristine mirrors, then at the door where Harold had exited moments earlier. He was familiar with Harold, even if Harold didn't know him. That quiet man in the janitor's uniform had worked in the building longer than most people in the company, including Lawrence. There was something admirable about Harold's unshakable work ethic. He came in every night, never complained, and left the place spotless. People like Harold were the backbone of the world, though they rarely got the credit they deserved. The man straightened his jacket and adjusted his tie, his mind racing. This wasn't just about Harold, it was about something bigger. A culture, a mindset, that allowed people like Lawrence to wield power without accountability. He decided right then and there that he couldn't just walk away. Meanwhile, Harold made his way down the quiet hallway, his cart bumping over the seams in the tiles. He tried to focus on the familiar rhythm of his routine, but Lawrence's words echoed in his head. Too old. Too slow. Pathetic. He'd faced his share of prejudice over the years, but it didn't make it any easier. Harold had grown up in a time and place where opportunities were scarce for someone like him. He'd fought hard for everything he had, sacrificing more than most people would ever know. Retirement wasn't an option, not because he didn't deserve it, but because life hadn't left him much choice. He needed the job, plain and simple. Reaching the storage closet, Harold put away his cleaning supplies with deliberate care. Each motion was a small rebellion against the hurt threatening to overwhelm him. If he couldn't control how others treated him, he could at least take pride in how he carried himself. At the same time, in an office on the top floor, Lawrence leaned back in his chair, laughing to himself as he recounted the night's events to a colleague over the phone. I mean, you should have seen the guy. Just shuffling around like a dinosaur. I swear, it's like he doesn't even know what year it is. The colleague on the other end chuckled uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to respond. Yeah, but isn't he, like, a nice guy? I mean, he's always polite when I see him. Lawrence rolled his eyes. Nice doesn't get the floors cleaned any faster. Honestly, the guy's a liability. If I had my way, he'd be out of here tomorrow. As Lawrence hung up the call, he felt a sense of satisfaction, as though belittling Harold somehow validated his own importance. He didn't notice the quiet knock on his office door until it opened slightly. Mr. Lawrence. The voice was calm, measured. Lawrence turned to see the man from the restroom standing in the doorway. He frowned, trying to place him. Yes. Can I help you? Lawrence asked, his tone clipped. The man stepped inside, closing the door behind him. I couldn't help but overhear you earlier, he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge. In the restroom. Lawrence's frown deepened, his mind racing. And you are? Someone who doesn't take kindly to what I heard, the man replied, his eyes narrowing. You see, it's one thing to have an opinion. It's another to degrade someone who's done nothing to deserve it. Lawrence chuckled, though there was an uneasy note in his voice. Look, I don't know who you think you are, but I don't have time for this. If you have a complaint, take it to HR. Oh, don't worry. I will, the man said, his tone calm but resolute. But first, I wanted to give you a chance to explain yourself. Why do you think it's acceptable to speak about someone like that? Lawrence bristled, his temper flaring. I don't owe you any explanations. If you're so concerned about the janitor's feelings, maybe you should get a mop and help him out. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying Lawrence as though trying to understand how someone could be so blind to their own behavior. Finally, he said, "You'll regret this." Lawrence scoffed, waving him off. "Get out of my office." The man turned to leave, but not before adding, "This isn't over." As the door closed behind him, Lawrence shook his head, muttering to himself. He didn't know who that guy was, but he wasn't about to let some self-righteous stranger ruin his night. What Lawrence didn't know was that the man had connections, powerful ones. And as the hours ticked by, events were already being set into motion that would expose more than just Lawrence's behavior. Down in the janitorial storage room, Harold finished his shift in silence. He didn't know that someone had overheard Lawrence or that plans were underway to confront the manager. All Harold knew was that he was tired of the long hours, tired of being invisible, and tired of feeling like he wasn't enough. But Harold was also resilient. He'd faced bigger challenges than a rude manager, and he wasn't about to let a few harsh words break him. As he clocked out and stepped into the chilly night air, he resolved to keep doing his best. Because no matter what anyone said, Harold knew the value of his work, and of himself. Unbeknownst to him, a storm was brewing. And when it broke, it would reveal the truth about Lawrence, Harold, and the quiet power of those who refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. The question wasn't if justice would be served, it was how. And when. As Harold walked home under the streetlights, the weight of the night began to lift, if only slightly. He couldn't know that soon, his life was about to change in ways he never imagined. For better or worse, the events of this night were only the beginning. The next morning, the office hummed with its usual buzz. Employees arrived with their coffee cups and briefcases, exchanging polite nods and hurried greetings. No one gave much thought to Harold, who quietly worked through his routine like always, tidying up the break room and emptying trash bins before disappearing into the background. But there was something different about the air today, something unspoken yet heavy. It started with a ripple of whispers near the elevators. By mid-morning, those whispers had spread to the cubicles, weaving through the office like an invisible thread. "Did you hear about what happened last night? I heard it was bad. Really bad. Who do you think reported it?" No one seemed to know the full story, but the speculation was enough to create a palpable tension. Lawrence, meanwhile, remained oblivious. He strode into the office with his usual swagger, nodding curtly at his assistant before locking himself in his corner office. Inside, he leaned back in his chair, scrolling through emails. A few were marked urgent, including one from HR, but he dismissed them for now. Whatever it was, it could wait. He had more important things to focus on, like preparing for his quarterly meeting with the executive team. Downstairs, Harold worked methodically, oblivious to the storm brewing just a few floors above him. He was too focused on finishing his tasks before the midday rush. He didn't notice the way some employees glanced at him as they passed, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. In another part of the building, the man from the restroom was busy making phone calls. His name was Jonathan, and he wasn't just any employee, he was a consultant brought in by the company's board to evaluate internal culture and operations. What he overheard in the restroom the night before wasn't just an unfortunate moment, it was a glaring example of everything wrong with the company's environment. Jonathan had spent the morning gathering details. He reviewed employee records, including Harold's and Lawrence's. What he found only strengthened his resolve. Harold had been with the company for nearly 2 decades, his file spotless except for a minor incident years ago when he took a sick day without filing the proper paperwork. Lawrence's record, on the other hand, was littered with complaints, mostly minor ones, but enough to paint a troubling picture. The most damning revelation came when Jonathan spoke with a few employees in confidence. Their stories revealed a pattern. Lawrence had a habit of belittling those he considered beneath him. Janitors, receptionists, junior staff, none were spared from his condescending remarks. Yet, nothing had ever been done about it. By lunchtime, the whispers had turned into hushed conversations, and Lawrence was starting to notice. He stepped out of his office, scanning the room with narrowed eyes. People avoided his gaze, quickly turning back to their work. "What's going on?" Lawrence demanded, stopping by his assistant's desk. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. I think HR is looking into something." "Into what?" "I'm not sure," she stammered, lowering her eyes. Lawrence's jaw tightened. He stormed back to his office and opened the email from HR he'd ignored earlier. His eyes scanned the words, and his stomach sank. There was going to be an investigation, a formal one, into his behavior. Fuming, Lawrence slammed his laptop shut. This had to be a mistake. Someone was out to get him, probably that consultant. He couldn't imagine anyone else in the office having the nerve to report him. As the day wore on, the tension only grew. Harold, still unaware of the full scope of events, continued his work. He was in the middle of mopping the lobby floor when Jonathan approached him. "Harold, can we talk for a moment?" Jonathan asked, his tone gentle. Harold straightened, leaning on the mop handle. Sure. Did I miss something?" "No, nothing like that," Jonathan assured him. "I just wanted to ask you a few questions about your experience here. Off the record, of course." Harold looked wary but nodded. "All right. What do you want to know?" Jonathan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Have you ever felt disrespected or mistreated by anyone here? Especially management?" Harold's grip tightened on the mop. He didn't answer right away, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't like to complain," he said finally. "I've got a job, and I'm thankful for that." "I understand," Jonathan said. "But it's important that we address any issues. You don't deserve to be treated poorly, Harold. No one does." Harold shifted uncomfortably, unsure how much to say. He didn't want to stir up trouble, but the memory of Lawrence's words from the night before was still fresh. "Sometimes people don't realize the impact of their words," Harold said quietly. "But I'm not here to cause problems. I just do my job and try to stay out of the way." Jonathan nodded, respecting Harold's cautious approach. "Well, if you ever want to talk about anything, my door is always open." "Thank you," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. As Jonathan walked away, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that something big was happening, something he didn't fully understand. Upstairs, Lawrence was in full damage control mode. He called a few trusted colleagues, fishing for information, but no one seemed to know much. The uncertainty gnawed at him. For the first time in his career, he felt vulnerable, and he didn't like it one bit. By the end of the day, the atmosphere in the office was electric with anticipation. People speculated about what would happen next, though no one dared to voice their thoughts too loudly. As Harold packed up his cart for the night, he noticed a few employees watching him from the corner of their eyes. He offered a polite nod, but they quickly looked away. It was unsettling, and Harold couldn't shake the feeling that he was at the center of something far bigger than he realized. Meanwhile, Jonathan prepared his next steps. He knew the investigation would take time, but he wasn't willing to wait for justice to be served. There were other ways to hold people accountable, and he had every intention of using them. As the building emptied for the night, the stage was set for what was to come. Harold, Lawrence, and everyone else in the office were about to be caught in a storm that would reveal truths long buried. But how those truths would be handled, and who would come out unscathed, remained to be seen. The office was quieter than usual the following morning, though the tension was thicker than ever. Harold walked in, his usual routine feeling strangely heavy, as if he were stepping into a place he no longer recognized. Whispers still followed him wherever he went, and though he didn't know why, he could feel the weight of curious eyes on his back. Upstairs, Lawrence sat stiffly at his desk. His office, typically his fortress, now felt like a trap. The investigation wasn't just a rumor anymore, it was official. HR had scheduled a meeting with him that afternoon, and the email he'd received mentioned allegations of inappropriate conduct. It was infuriating. He wasn't about to let some busybody consultant and a bunch of oversensitive employees ruin his career. But for the first time, Lawrence wasn't as sure of his dominance. His colleagues were avoiding him, their usual casual banter replaced with tight smiles and excuses to leave the room. Even his assistant, who normally hung on his every word, barely looked him in the eye. The isolation was unnerving, and Lawrence hated how powerless he felt. Down in the break room, Harold was wiping down tables when Jonathan walked in. This time, he didn't ask Harold any questions. Instead, he simply offered a quiet, "How are you today, Harold?" Harold paused, the cloth in his hand hovering over a coffee ring. "I'm fine, I guess," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Jonathan gave him a small smile. "If you ever need to talk about anything, remember what I said. My door's open." Harold nodded but didn't reply. As Jonathan walked away, Harold couldn't help but wonder why this stranger seemed to care so much. He wasn't used to being noticed, let alone supported. It felt odd. Meanwhile, the HR team was busy behind closed doors, combing through complaints and testimonies. Jonathan had provided them with everything he'd heard and seen, but they were uncovering even more, things Jonathan hadn't been aware of. Lawrence's pattern of behavior stretched back years, with multiple employees describing incidents that painted a troubling picture. One account, in particular, stood out. A former employee who had been let go under dubious circumstances claimed Lawrence had humiliated them in front of their peers, reducing them to tears. The HR director, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia, read the statement with a grim expression. "This isn't just a one-time thing," Patricia said to her team. "It's a pattern. And it stops now." By lunchtime, the tension in the office had reached a boiling point. People whispered in groups, their eyes darting toward Lawrence's office door. Even Harold could feel the undercurrent of anticipation, though he still didn't understand why. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that the first domino fell. Lawrence's meeting with HR was scheduled for 3 o'clock, but at 2:30, a loud, angry voice echoed through the hallway. "This is ridiculous." Lawrence barked as he stormed out of his office, his face red with fury. "You think you can just accuse me of?" He stopped abruptly, realizing too late that everyone in the open office could hear him. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward him. Lawrence's gaze swept over the crowd, his chest heaving. He tried to compose himself, straightening his tie and glaring at the nearest employee. "What are you all looking at? Get back to work." People quickly turned away, but the damage was done. The spectacle only added fuel to the fire, and Lawrence knew it. As he marched toward the HR office, his mind raced. He needed to get ahead of this, to control the narrative. Maybe he could claim it was all a misunderstanding, or better yet, blame someone else. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be that easy. In the janitor's closet, Harold was finishing up his shift when he heard the commotion. He poked his head out into the hallway, catching a glimpse of Lawrence's retreating figure. Harold frowned, a sense of unease settling over him. Whatever was happening, it seemed big, bigger than anything he could have imagined. Jonathan stood at the far end of the hallway, watching Lawrence disappear into the HR office. He felt a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. This was what he'd been working toward, but it was also just the beginning. Confronting someone like Lawrence was never simple, and Jonathan knew there would be fallout. Back in the HR office, Patricia faced Lawrence across the table. His bluster was gone now, replaced with a defensive posture as he leaned forward in his chair. "This is absurd," Lawrence said, his voice tight. "I've been with this company for years. You can't just take the word of a few disgruntled employees and—" "Mr. Lawrence," Patricia interrupted, her tone firm. "This isn't just about 1 or 2 complaints. We've spoken to multiple employees, reviewed your record, and gathered enough evidence to warrant this investigation. This is your opportunity to explain your actions." Lawrence's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He was trapped, and he knew it. As the clock ticked closer to the end of the workday, the entire office seemed to hold its breath. Harold, oblivious to the details, continued his work, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. In the HR office, Lawrence's voice rose again, this time tinged with desperation. "This is a witch hunt. You have no proof." "Enough," Patricia said sharply, cutting him off. "We'll be concluding this meeting for now. You'll receive further communication from us soon." Lawrence stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. His face was a mask of rage as he stalked through the office, ignoring the stares that followed him. As he passed the break room, he caught sight of Harold, who was wiping down a countertop. Something in Lawrence snapped. He stopped in his tracks, turning to face the janitor. "You," Lawrence spat, his voice dripping with venom. "I bet this is your doing." Harold looked up, startled. "Me? I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," Lawrence growled, stepping closer. "You think you can just—" "Mr. Lawrence." Jonathan's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. He stepped into the room, positioning himself between Lawrence and Harold. "That's enough," Jonathan said firmly. "Leave him alone." Lawrence glared at Jonathan, his fists clenched. For a moment, it seemed like he might push back, but then he turned on his heel and stormed out of the building. Harold stood frozen, his heart pounding. He looked at Jonathan, confusion and gratitude warring in his eyes. "What just happened?" Jonathan placed a reassuring hand on Harold's shoulder. "It's a long story, Harold. But trust me, things are about to change." As the door swung shut behind Lawrence, the tension in the office reached its breaking point. Everyone knew that the storm wasn't over yet. If anything, it was just beginning. And when it finally broke, no one would be left untouched. The office was still humming with tension as Lawrence's heavy footsteps disappeared down the hall. Harold stood in the break room, shaken but trying to process what had just happened. Jonathan gave him a nod, signaling that he didn't need to worry. But Harold wasn't sure that was true. For years, he had kept his head down, avoided confrontation, and done his job without expecting recognition. Now, somehow, he was at the center of a whirlwind, and he didn't even know how he'd ended up there. Jonathan, on the other hand, felt the weight of responsibility settling squarely on his shoulders. Protecting Harold was just one piece of this puzzle. The deeper issue was the toxic environment Lawrence had cultivated for years, and Jonathan was determined to see it dismantled. Still, even Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he'd missed, something bigger simmering beneath the surface. By the time the office emptied out for the day, the tension had only thickened. Employees lingered longer than usual, whispering to one another in hushed tones. Most assumed Lawrence wouldn't be returning, but no one knew for sure. The uncertainty was unnerving. Harold was one of the last to leave. As he wheeled his cart toward the janitor's closet, he noticed something strange. Lawrence's office door, usually shut tight, was slightly ajar. Harold paused, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. When the coast seemed clear, he stepped closer. Through the narrow opening, Harold could see the faint glow of a computer screen. Papers were scattered across the desk, and a half-empty coffee cup sat abandoned near the edge. Something about the scene felt wrong. Lawrence was meticulous, almost obsessively so. He would never leave his office in such disarray, especially if he thought he might return. Harold hesitated, his instinct telling him to walk away. But something pulled him forward. Quietly, he pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. The room smelled faintly of cologne and stress. Harold's eyes were drawn to the computer screen, where an email draft was open. He couldn't make out all the words, but the subject line caught his attention: confidential, urgent action needed. Curiosity and unease warred within him. He knew he shouldn't be there, but something about the email felt important, like it might hold answers to questions he hadn't even thought to ask. Before he could decide what to do, a voice behind him made him jump. "Harold? What are you doing in here?" He spun around to see Jonathan standing in the doorway, his expression a mix of surprise and concern. I didn't mean to," Harold stammered, gesturing helplessly toward the desk. "The door was open, and I just—" Jonathan stepped inside, his gaze shifting to the computer screen. When he saw the subject line, his brow furrowed. "That's odd," he muttered, more to himself than to Harold. "What do you mean?" Harold asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved closer to the desk, scanning the email draft. After a moment, he sighed and turned back to Harold. "This doesn't make sense. Lawrence wouldn't leave something like this behind unless—" "Unless what?" Harold pressed, feeling a chill run down his spine. Jonathan shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Unless he wanted someone to find it." Harold blinked, confused. "But why would he do that?" "I don't know," Jonathan admitted, though his tone suggested he had his suspicions. "But whatever's going on, we need to tread carefully. There's more to this than we realized." The two men left the office together, Harold's mind racing with questions. What was Lawrence up to? And why did Jonathan seem so certain that this wasn't over? The next morning, the office was eerily quiet. Lawrence's absence was noticeable, but it wasn't the only thing creating unease. Patricia from HR had sent out a company-wide email early that morning, announcing a mandatory meeting for all employees at noon. The email offered no details, only stating that the meeting would address recent developments. Speculation spread like wildfire, with everyone wondering what bombshell was about to drop. When the meeting finally began, the conference room was packed. Employees sat shoulder to shoulder, their expressions a mix of curiosity and dread. Harold stood at the back of the room, unsure why he had been asked to attend but too nervous to question it. Patricia took the floor, her usual composed demeanor tinged with an edge of seriousness. Beside her stood Jonathan, his arms crossed as he scanned the room. "Thank you all for being here," Patricia began. "As many of you are aware, there have been some serious allegations regarding the behavior of a senior manager. We want to assure you that these matters are being handled with the utmost care and urgency." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd, but Patricia raised a hand to quiet them. "We've also uncovered some additional concerns that need to be addressed," she continued. "Concerns that suggest this situation may be part of a larger issue." Harold's stomach sank. He glanced at Jonathan, whose expression remained unreadable. Patricia's next words sent a shockwave through the room. "Effective immediately, Lawrence Evans is no longer with the company. Additionally, we have reason to believe that certain actions taken by Mr. Evans in recent months may have violated not only company policy but also federal regulations." The room erupted into chaos. People whispered furiously to one another, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of disbelief and speculation. Harold felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Jonathan standing beside him. "Are you okay?" Jonathan asked quietly. "I think so," Harold said, though he wasn't sure it was true. Jonathan nodded, his gaze returning to Patricia as she tried to regain control of the room. "Please understand," Patricia said, raising her voice to be heard over the commotion, "that this is an ongoing investigation. We ask for your cooperation and discretion as we work to resolve these matters." As the meeting broke up, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. Lawrence might be gone, but whatever he had been involved in still lingered like a shadow over the office. Jonathan pulled Harold aside before he could leave. "There's more to this than what Patricia just said," Jonathan murmured, his voice low. "What do you mean?" Harold asked, his heart pounding. "I think Lawrence was covering something up," Jonathan said, his eyes narrowing. "And I think it's connected to you." Harold froze, the weight of Jonathan's words sinking in. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. And for reasons he couldn't yet understand, Harold was right in the middle of it. Harold sat quietly in the janitor's closet later that day, his mind spinning as he tried to piece everything together. The words Jonathan had said echoed in his mind, "I think it's connected to you." Harold had always thought of himself as someone who stayed under the radar, someone who did his job and kept out of trouble. So why was he suddenly at the center of something so much bigger than himself? As he finished folding a stack of clean rags, the door opened, and Jonathan stepped inside. He closed the door behind him and leaned against the wall, his expression serious but not unkind. "We need to talk," Jonathan said. Harold sighed. "I figured as much." Jonathan nodded. "Lawrence left more than a mess behind. Patricia and I have been digging into his actions, and we've uncovered some things that don't add up. Financial discrepancies, unexplained expenses, and records that were conveniently altered. But the most troubling part? Some of it ties back to the custodial department, your department." Harold frowned, confused. "My department? I don't understand. I don't handle anything like that. I just clean." "I know," Jonathan said quickly. "And that's exactly why this doesn't make sense. It's clear Lawrence was using his position to manipulate certain processes. We believe he was funneling company funds through fake maintenance requests, inflating costs, and pocketing the difference. And because the paperwork came from your department, it gave him the perfect cover." Harold stared at him, the weight of Jonathan's words settling in. "But I never approved anything like that. I didn't even know it was happening." "That's what we're trying to confirm," Jonathan said. "Your name appears on some of the documents, but I'm sure they were forged. Lawrence probably assumed no one would ever question it. Who's going to scrutinize a janitor's signature, right?" The thought made Harold's stomach churn. He had always prided himself on his honesty and hard work. To think that someone like Lawrence had used his name to cover up something so dishonest, it was infuriating. "What happens now?" Harold asked. Jonathan hesitated, then said, "We're turning everything over to the legal team. They'll determine the next steps, but you're in the clear, Harold. Everyone knows you had nothing to do with this." Relief washed over Harold, but it was quickly replaced by a deep sense of anger. Lawrence had not only belittled him but had also tried to use him as a scapegoat. Harold clenched his fists, his voice steady but firm. "I hope he gets what he deserves." Jonathan nodded. "He will. Patricia's already contacted the authorities. This goes beyond company policy, this is fraud." Over the next few weeks, the office slowly began to settle back into a routine, though the lingering effects of Lawrence's actions were still felt. Employees seemed more cautious, more aware of the importance of speaking up when something didn't feel right. Harold noticed the difference, too. People who had once barely acknowledged him were now going out of their way to say hello or thank him for his work. One afternoon, Patricia approached Harold in the break room. She handed him an envelope, her expression warm. "What's this?" Harold asked, surprised. "It's from the company," Patricia said. "A small gesture of appreciation for everything you've been through. You didn't deserve any of it, and we want to make sure you know how valued you are." Harold opened the envelope and found a handwritten note, along with a gift card to his favorite restaurant. It wasn't much, but the thought behind it meant everything to him. As the weeks turned into months, the memory of Lawrence's actions began to fade, replaced by a renewed sense of unity in the office. Harold found himself walking taller, his once overlooked presence now met with respect. One day, as he mopped the floors near the conference room, Jonathan stopped by to chat. "Things feel different around here, don't they?" Jonathan said, leaning on the doorframe. "They do," Harold agreed. "It's better." Jonathan smiled. "You had a lot to do with that, you know. If you hadn't stood your ground, if you hadn't been the person you are, this place wouldn't have changed. You showed everyone what integrity looks like." Harold looked down at his mop, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I just did my job. You did more than that, Jonathan said. You reminded people what's important. And that's not something everyone can do. Harold didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded, his chest swelling with quiet pride. As the day wound to a close, Harold finished his work and locked up the janitor's closet. Stepping outside into the cool evening air, he felt lighter than he had in years. The events of the past few months had been challenging, but they had also given him something he hadn't realized he was missing, a sense of purpose, of belonging. And as he walked home that night, Harold couldn't help but feel that, in his own small way, he had made a difference. For the first time in a long time, he was proud, not just of his work, but of himself.